1966. So I missed it in terms of my personal life. Specifically to Quaker House, a group of active members of the military from what was then called Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, North Carolina, not surprisingly, like many other members of the military, were not happy about having been drafted and were looking for ways to try to figure out how to stop being drafted and stop being part of the military. At that time, there was no Quaker meeting in Fayetteville. There was no Quaker presence of any type. So they basically got in a car in 1968, drove north in North Carolina up to the Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh area, found a couple of the Quaker meetings that are up there, and literally said, "So we hear Quakers are good with peace stuff, can you help?" And that's basically where we started. Those meetings got together and said, yes, now we need to figure out what in the world yes means. And they went and rented a small house in downtown Fayetteville, and from the point of view of somebody who grew up just after this, in absolutely stereotypical late 1960s, early 1970s style, it was a place for people to go and hang out and rap. There are pictures, there are stories of people just sitting on the front porch, old beat up couches, lawn chairs, all of the stereotypes that you think of from that period, with the obvious exception, no drugs, no alcohol, so I'm told. That's where the motto of Quaker House, a place of peace in a town of war. Fayetteville is a company town. Fort Bragg, Fort Liberty now, we just changed the name. I'll switch back and forth. I'm still learning the new name. Is the largest military base in the continental United States. 60,000 active members of the military, all of their adjacent family members and then civilians. It is the center, the headquarters for Army Joint Special Forces. So if you've ever heard of the Green Berets, if you've ever heard of Delta Force, they're based at Fort Liberty, at Fort Bragg. That's the world that these soldiers were coming out of. They started printing a little magazine, a little newspaper, Bragg Briefs. It had funny little cartoons in it. We've got copies of it. I think one of the pictures on one of the screens has that. If not, then I need to load one on. That's what we started doing. And the young Quaker from Chapel Hill that they hired, who lived at Quaker House, their job was to figure out how to help these people get out. So from day one, how to file to be a conscience objector when you're already in the military, and the other conversations. We still do that to this day. That is one of the core missions that Quaker House does to this day. In the 1990s, we helped found what's called the GI Rights Hotline, and we have some of the cards over there, and I know some of the screens has some of the people from that. Two of my staff, full-time, work on the hotline. They take, between the two of them, husband and wife team, between 250 and 300 phone calls, and in quotes, I'll explain what that means in a minute, per month of the hotline. So that's literally an 800 number, but it's also 2023, so it's texting, it's email, it's web chats, it's all of the versions of what a hotline should be in 2023. That they're talking to people who, nationwide, worldwide, who are in the military saying, help. Just like in 1969, I'm in the military, I'm not sure if this was a good thing, what can I do? Most of the time, that ends up with our helping them get some type of discharge, whether it's a conscience objector. In the last few years, a lot of them were getting out for being vaccine refusers, because that was nice and fast. Then that went away. So our counselors basically spent all last winter with people saying, I thought I was getting out, and now suddenly they're not letting me get out. Like literally, they had the paperwork processed. They were out the door because they had refused to take the vaccine, and then the military said, "Guess what? You get to stay. Aren't you so happy that you get to stay?" And they weren't that happy. We still do that. If you know the group Center for Conscience and War in Washington, D.C., they're also one of the founders of the network, of the hotline. So we still do that every day. Like I said, almost 300 calls per month for that.
What kind of a VPN line or what kind of a privacy, super encrypted, or what do you do to be able to have a phone line that they can call from, Afghanistan, or wherever they are, and maybe not be listened to, so they can have a conversation?
Fortunately now, about 10 years ago, we caught up on technology. It once was just a straight POTS line, because, an 800 number, but still a plain old telephone line. And that was a concern. But honestly, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier during dinner, you have to think about it from the point of view of a bureaucrat, whether in the military or not. In the universe of things that the military worries about, the brand new recruit who's calling an 800 number to complain that he misses his mommy. Remember, this is what the military is going to think of it as. He thinks his drill sergeant, it's almost always a he, his drill sergeant's being mean to him, he hates the food, he misses his mommy. They don't care. So they really weren't paying attention. The more logistic answer now is we have a voice over internet protocol, which both, for our point of view, just logistically, it makes it much easier because counselors who are in California, counselors who are in Washington, D.C., counselors who are in North Carolina, as with any VoIP phone, it works exactly the same. But it's also incredibly hard to tap a VoIP phone. I actually switched Quaker House's main line from a POTS line to a VoIP line, just in case.
Do you use Signal?
Sorry?
Do you use Signal?
No. I use, for the Quaker House itself, I use Vonage as our vendor, and I have not felt the need to seek out higher level encryption. There was a time, and in fact I have copies of the redacted reports, that back in the 60s, Quaker House was investigated. There were stories of military intelligence sitting outside and watching the soldiers wrapping on the chairs and all of that. It's probably the case that the original house that was Quaker House was firebombed. It definitely burned down, and people almost got killed. And the new Quaker House, on the picture where I live, much nicer house. I've seen the pictures. I'm really glad I don't live where. It was a dump. It was a dump in 1969 terms. Yeah, back then, absolutely. But what we can do now to protect those conversations didn't exist back then. So they couldn't do it. But yeah, if we needed to, and if people asked, we have things we can do. I'm not going to go into a lot of those details, but in general, we rely on being ignorable. When they call the 800 number, when they're sending email, we're relying on sort of the background commercial level of it's not worth anybody working that hard to pay attention to these conversations. But people who are in Green Berets, people who are Delta, they're not calling us. They drunk the Kool-Aid. Again, I'm showing my age. It's the 19-year-old, it's the 18-year-old, it's the 17-year-old, and that's part of what I wanted to focus on in terms of part of that element of our work. The young people who get lied to by the recruiters. That's who Stephen Lenore talking to more than anyone else. Not surprisingly, because once you've got your Ranger tab, once you've jumped out of the airplane enough times that you've got your parachute thing, you're pretty convinced that this is a good idea. You're past making a decision about whether your conscience objector or not. Those people actually come to Quaker House for a different reason. Thank you for the segue. In the early 2000s, if you remember, many more people in the world generally started talking about post-traumatic stress, started talking about all of the effects that trauma has on people's lives for the rest of their lives. And my predecessors recognized that if the baseline of what Quaker House does is try to help people who have been harmed, have been injured by participation in the military, that addressing issues of PTSD, of substance abuse, of moral injury, of sexual assault, of domestic violence, that was something that we weren't doing enough with. They founded what we now call the Quaker House Counseling Service. We used to call it the Domestic Violence and Substance Abuse and Sexual Assault Counseling Service, which I couldn't remember the name of. Hence, counseling service. It's exactly what it sounds like. I have a social worker, a licensed social worker, who works with between 10 and 15 people per week. Active members of the military, their families, recent veterans. Completely anonymous. I can tell you, because what I know is Josh is coming at 9:30 to work with my counselor. John is coming at 10 or 10:30. I know their first names, I know what time they're coming. That is it. We don't bill, there's no insurance record, there's no nothing. Joanna keeps the medical records that she has to keep as a professional, but those are her records. They are protected under medical privacy, under all of those rules. Somebody could break into Quaker House today, and if they could get into our computer records, my computer's behind you, so they'd have to work to do that. What they would know is Josh comes at 9:30. They wouldn't even know which Josh. We actually got 3 of them, so that's why I use his name, because even there, I mean, yeah, I'm even anonymizing him with that name. We've got teenagers. One of the people who comes now, we were talking before about my dog, is a young woman. She's 16 years old. One of her parents is military, and things have been bad. We'll leave it at that. She particularly likes animals, but she has a sibling who has a pet allergy, so they can't have animals in her house. I have an old dog and 3 cats. So she always comes a few minutes early, and I'm always careful to make sure I'm there when she's coming for her appointment, so she can come and pet Dante and see the cats and all. So that's, I have a law degree. That's the best counseling I can do for her. I've got a social worker who can do the real work. So we do that. We help those people. Pre-pandemic, there was an AA group who met at Quaker House every week. That group seems to have gone away with the pandemic. I would like us to get back into that. We're still recovering from the pandemic, just like everybody else. That hasn't come back yet. Mm-hmm. And so, what is my job? I've got these counselors who work for the hotline who do all of that. I've got a licensed social worker who does the counseling service. My job: keep the lights on, get the bills paid, and end wars. Little thing. We were talking, I've lost Carol, we were talking before about if you think all wars are bad, if you think all military, that there should be no more military, how does that jive with the mission of Quaker House? To take care of the people who've been injured. There are a lot of people who think that's contradictory. I grew up Quaker. I grew up with Sandy Spring Meeting. I grew up in the 1970s. I grew up with all soldiers bad, end of conversation. I was 12, so I'm entitled to simplistic thinking. To this day, if I have to boil it down, Am I at all wars bad? Absolutely. Am I at not entirely thrilled with all militaries? Absolutely. But until I as a Quaker, I as a person, I as a pacifist, can end all wars, can reach the point where I can go to my board and say, guess what? There are no more armies, there are no more wars, time to sell the house, time to fire me, we're done. Until that happens, we have an obligation to take care of the people that we've failed by the fact that we haven't succeeded yet. The people who are injured because they joined the military, are injured, and I'm going to come back to this in a little more detail in a minute, are injured because their spouse joined the military, because mom or dad joined the military, and now they're sick and dying because they drank the water at Camp Lejeune in 1980. They drank the water or played in the dirt at Fort Bragg, at Fort Hood, any military base that has aircraft. I'll come back to that too. The advertising for today talks specifically about young people, about recruiting. That's something that Quaker House has worked with a lot over the years. Like everybody else, the pandemic sort of changed all of that conversation because the recruiters suddenly couldn't get into the schools. My youngest child is about to start his junior year at Emory. He spent his junior year and senior year of high school on a television. Robert stands 6'3". Robert is beautiful. He is 6'3", built. The Marine recruiter who found out about Robert in Columbia, Maryland, clearly thought that Robert was going to be the next poster child from the Marines. This is a kid who grew up Quaker. This is a kid who never took the ASVAB, kept saying, I'm Quaker. They called not just every week, it was every day. They called his phone, they called my phone. They were that desperate to try to recruit in the middle of the pandemic that they were doing that. And that was when you weren't seeing news articles in every single paper every day talking about the Army isn't going to make their numbers this year. The Army didn't. They fell short by 20,000 people last year. They're going to fall short by 10,000 people this year. And the only reason that they're 10,000, only short 10,000 this year is because their retention is up. People, if you read the newsletter that's over there, Stephen Lenore talked in their article about the fact that they're talking to people who are calling the hotline and report that the amount of pushback that those people are getting for trying to get out has gotten a lot harder. That the recruiters, the amount of pressure to keep people in, to keep the numbers up, by just not letting people out, is up. What does that mean? Oh, the other statistic, this was just in this week's newspaper, which is why I forgot about it. Army recruiters are now working a 6-day week. Do not ever, you don't ever want to be an Army recruiter. It is, EOD, explosive demolition, is a less bad job than being a military recruiter. Every stereotype you know about car salesmen, Army recruiters, military recruiters, way worse. The pressure that they're under to meet their quotas, just like the car salesman, except that they're dealing with lives. And they're telling every story that they can possibly tell. It's everything, every stereotype you imagine. They go and they talk to the 16-year-old. I used this specific example for a long time until I actually met somebody who came from this exact example. Living in a trailer home, one parent, parents addicted to substances, they barely graduated high school, nobody in town has a job unless they're working for the meth lab in the next trailer parked down the street. There is nothing for them. And the military recruiter comes along and says, join the Army, join the Air Force, you'll get an education, you'll travel the world, you'll get paid, you'll get health care. As much as I hate the military, as much as I hate recruiting, if all you have are bad choices, that bad choice may not look so bad, especially when the recruiters tell you all of the promises and they don't say, oh, and by the way, you might get shot at. By the way, we're going to teach you how to kill people. We're going to teach you how to change your personality so that the idea of killing people is just fine with you. But we're not going to tell you how to turn it off. We're not going to tell you how, after you've spent all day doing your practice on base, you go home and you have a fight with your spouse, how not to beat them up, how not to kill them. They're not going to tell you how to deal with all of the after effects that lead to the substance abuse, lead to the drugs, lead to the alcoholism. They're not going to tell you that when you get out and it's time to go and use your GI Bill benefits and go to college and all that despite the fact that they spend a year training you on how to kill, they spend maybe a day telling you about what it's like to get out. They don't, for lack of a better word, they don't deprogram. They spent millions and millions of dollars after World War II discovering that most of the soldiers, I think the statistic is apocryphal, but it's the one that's always quoted, that out of every 10 soldiers that fired the weapon in World War II, only 3 actually were aiming at anybody. I don't know. That's the statistic. I'm dubious.
Could you repeat that?
Supposedly, out of every 10 soldiers on the line in World War II, only 3 of them actually were aiming at the enemy.
Similarly in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you differentiate between soldiers and Marines in World War II, that statistic is believable. If you don't, I don't buy it.
Yes, certainly Marines, especially back then. I agree.
In the Pacific Theater, the Marines were shooting at people.
Yes.
Many of the soldiers in the European theater were firing artillery at interesting clubs. There was a difference there.
Or not at all, which is what the statistic was. The point of that, the most important point for now, is that the government spent a lot of money trying to change that number.
Yeah.
How do we teach these people to want to kill?
Right.
How do we teach them to not care about who they're shooting at? And that's what, the dehumanizing. Got people from Veterans for Peace, so I am absolutely preaching to the choir here. And let me be clear, I grew up a good Quaker boy.
Yeah.
I haven't done this. So, I can talk the talk, and I struggle every day as an ex-trial lawyer and somebody who talks to soldiers every day. When I'm talking to Quakers, I am working very hard not to use certain words in my conversations. Yeah. If I only manage to use the F word one time tonight, we'll be happy. So, but it's a lingo. I mean, it's those jokes about the way that they talk.
Yeah.
They're real. But yeah, and in case you didn't know, trial lawyers are just as bad. I've never talked to a soldier about this. Trial lawyers, every time we hear a screech of tires on the highway and there's no thud, you have this brief moment of disappointment. It's really sick. If you're from Maryland, you know that the people I worked with, their advertisement was, if you have a phone, you have a lawyer. I'm sure you all have one of those PI groups that everybody knows. It's any closed, indoctrinated community gets a little weird. Coming back to the point, I'm sorry. They spent those millions and millions of dollars training people how to kill. They did nothing, they still do almost nothing, training them how to stop.
Yeah.
That's where moral injury comes from. That's where PTSD comes from. That's why we have the counseling service. That's why I've got a 16-year-old who comes, because her parent doesn't know how to turn it off when they get mad at her other parent. So I'm trying very carefully to degenerize that story.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Then when you're reaching out to those soldiers in the military, do they actually, those people who have already served in combat, then are dealing with their own moral injury stuff come to you? Is that when they start saying, I've had enough? Or is it before that? Or is it different in different cases?
Not surprisingly, there is no single answer to that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've never asked, and I don't know that any of my predecessors ever asked Stephen Lenore to try to keep track of that. My dad was a demographer, so I'm a statistician at heart, so I keep wanting numbers that we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
What I do know is that there's absolutely, because I've looked, there's absolutely a number of calls movement relative to the news. What shocked me a little over a year ago is that in March of 2022, the number of calls did not go up. I absolutely would have bet you money that people at Fort Bragg, people at Fort Hood would have watched the TV and going, oh shit, I'm going to Europe sometime soon. I don't want to do this. I'm calling the hotline. And they didn't.
Mm.
This comes back, actually, to what I was saying a minute ago about my job as the director of Quaker House is to put myself out of work. If you think of Quakers as and the other peace churches as basically having been doing that type of work, we'll call it 450 years. 100 years ago, 120 years ago, a minor nobleman in East Europe got killed, his wife got killed, and suddenly 100 million people get killed in World War I. A Russian nutball attacks Ukraine in 2022. Does the entirety of Europe go to war? No, they do sanctions. I'm from DC. I will sit with you for a week and we can argue about the effectiveness of sanctions and the moral flaws of sanctions, and are you actually punishing the people in charge, or are you punishing the poor people in the streets who don't have any food? We can have that argument. And it's an absolutely legitimate argument. But I would rather be having an argument about whether or not we're doing violence with food and not people not having food. I would much rather have that argument than have an argument about whether or not we should shoot people, whether or not we should bomb them, whether or not we should use nuclear weapons. Is it still violence? Absolutely. I'll have that argument with you. But in 450 years, we've gotten from go to war to go to sanctions. We made a difference. The people looking for peace, people in the world trying to find a solution that doesn't involve bullets. We actually have made a difference. Something has changed a little bit, and it's way flawed. But every day when I get up and I say, okay, am I going to make a difference? Is this, and is what I'm doing today, other than trying to help young Gabby get through high school and be able to get to college, help her parent, because her parent actually comes and works with Joanna also, help her parent get to a point where they don't beat up their spouse, where they don't try to assault Gabby. If I can think about in 100 years, in 400 years, we've made that difference, then there is a way to keep doing something. One of us was talking before, and I've lost track of who it was. I apologize. I am notoriously bad on names and faces and crowds. But you and I, we were talking about Quakers sitting around and just talking about doing things versus doing things. I am a crappy Quaker. When I come to worship here tomorrow, there is a 50-50 chance that I am going to fall asleep during the meeting. I went to a memorial meeting 2 weeks ago for a man who I basically have known all my life. His wife ran the Young Friends program at Sandy Spring Meeting. He was on my membership committee. He was on my marriage committee. He was one of those people that if you are a person of faith, you want to be Take Nishiyoko. You want to be the person who walks into a room and everybody goes, oh, this is a person who has the Spirit, who has that of God, whatever words you want to use for it. He was that person. I'm not. God help you. If you come to Wayne Finegar and say, I'm having a crisis of faith, I don't know if there's a God, your problems are way bigger than whether or not you think there's a God. Because I am the last person that you want to have that conversation with. I cannot quote Bible verses. I am never going to be talking in Michigan. No one is ever going to say, ooh, the man of God came into the room because Wayne's here. I get things done. I make things happen. I ran Baltimore Yearly Meeting for 12 years. Then they decided to hire somebody else to be the general secretary, and I moved to Fayetteville. It was a good thing. I'm happy. The person who's running Baltimore Yearly Meeting is doing a fabulous job. I actually like Sarah a great deal. I want Quakers to do things. Now, who was it I was talking to who's just been coming to Quakerism for a little while, still doesn't comfortably identify as being a Quaker, and past experience with friends was people who did things, and you're looking for more Quakers to do things. So am I. In my 12 years at Baltimore Yearly Meeting, I watched committees sit and do nothing, year after year after year, and it made me crazy. Quaker committees, Quaker groups, when they have a thing to do, are effective. They do things. And when they do things out in the world, other people say, ooh, look, Quakers aren't dead. They don't wear the funny clothes anymore. Maybe they don't have to eat oatmeal at every meal. Depending on what type of religious history the United States they got, maybe they're allowed to have sex. I said I had 3 kids who grew up Quaker. One of them got sent to the principal's office because their elementary school teacher thought that they were being a jerk, because when the teacher said all the Quakers had died out, they raised their hand and said, I'm a Quaker. Sadly for them, their principal of their elementary school went to Swarthmore College. That didn't end well for the teacher. Yeah, it's, and you know, my kids, being their father's child, was just as much of a snot-nosed kid as their father was in the day, and so, yeah, Robert absolutely milked that when he went back to his teacher. Principal Larner says, so, if you can do a thing, if every individual friend, every meeting can find a thing to do, I get the privilege of getting to talk about peace, of getting to work for peace. Somebody pays me to do this thing that otherwise I'd be doing around my job. So I'm incredibly privileged, and I know it. And it doesn't have to be peace. Maybe you individually, maybe your meeting, for good reason or not, maybe you have a specific reason to want to do environmental stuff. Right now, God knows reproductive rights is certainly a reasonable thing to worry about. Voting rights, I mean, pick your topic, but do a thing. Find a thing to do and keep doing it. Baltimore Yearly Meeting has a lot of meetings that are in college towns. One of the projects that I kept beating the drum about was what I always call meetings at work with a concern for pizza. I wanted a Quaker to go to that local college every Thursday, every other Thursday at 7 o'clock, get one of the classrooms assigned to them, sit, have meeting for worship for half an hour, and have a pizza. Plan for years that nobody's coming. You're going to go and do that for half an hour, 45 minutes, and taking home a pizza. But someday, some kid is going to be walking down the hall and go, pizza. I don't know, maybe I'm old. It was pizza in my day, maybe it's burritos now, but, and come in and say, what's this? And the friend explains it to him, gives him a slice of pizza. Maybe sends them home with the whole pizza if they're sick of pizza themselves. Maybe that kid comes back. Maybe they bring a friend. If you can keep doing that and have faith that one person can make a difference by doing a thing again and again and again, that someday you're going to have that little difference. You're going to make that little bit of change that then in 100 years means that instead of starting World War III, you have sanctions when Russia invades Ukraine. Is that a hand up or just stretching?
When it's right time, I don't know.